Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 9th paragraph of the first chapter of the first book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The result in war is never absolute. So here we go. The result in war is never absolute. Lastly, even the final decision of a world war is not always to be regarded as absolute. The conquered state often sees in it only a passing evil, which may be repaired in after times by means of political combinations. How much this must modify the degree of tension and the vigor of the efforts made is evident in itself. So very simple, very short today, but nevertheless very meaningful, very important as always. If you remember in the two previous paragraphs and actually up to the 6th, there are these demonstrations ex absurdo that von Clausewitz makes in order to demonstrate the modifications of war that happen in reality. So the demonstration passes by accepting in theory that war can tend to an extreme, fundamentally to his extremes that we have observed in the previous paragraphs, and he therefore concludes these absurd statements that he in fact reverses in this 7th, 8th, and 9th paragraphs respectively, to demonstrate instead certain evident truths of war. The 9th paragraph fundamentally corrects, is demonstrated by the absurd statement that if war contains within itself the solution perfect and complete, free from any reaction upon it, through a calculation beforehand of the political situation which will follow from it. So that was one of the three conditions that this extreme war that in fact doesn't exist in reality would really be. I'm quoting from the 6th paragraph. So in here, the explanation is quite simple. Von Clausewitz fundamentally demonstrates that proposition is to be false by observing the relation that exists between politics and war that he has already observed previously, and explaining that even the final decision of a world war is not always to be regarded as absolute, as fundamentally the conquered state often sees in this decision only a passing evil. In this outcome, a passing evil, which may be repaired in after times by means of political combinations. So this first of all entails that the enemy even is never to be fully to fully fulfill the enemies, the foes, your own in this case, will, because maybe for that war fundamentally, he gives up what he's been fighting for and accepts certain conditions, but this never entails this has to do rather with the fight in itself and the reasons that bring to that fight. Then in fact von Clausewitz underlines by saying that this political decisions, as we will see, modify the degree of tension and the vigor of the efforts made, and therefore accepts this setback fundamentally, and it simply hopes that in the future there will be certain political combinations, as von Clausewitz calls them, that will lead him to rise once again, and or to put it more, more correctly, that such evil of the loss of the war can be repaired after some time, and this can actually happen that the political combinations might include other war. Just think about, Germany between the two world wars. Fundamentally, that's what happened. Germany gets defeated, World War I. The French imposed this, especially the French, this very harsh conditions in Germany, and obviously there are certain political combinations, chiefly the crisis of the Weimar Republic and the rise of the National Socialists, that not only bring, bring Germany back to the status of power of, with a rocketing economy, with the restructuration of the armed forces, etc., but in fact to World War II, in which Germany gets defeated a second time. But that's really the point, is that there are constantly in war certain events that fundamentally reduce the tension of the war to its extremes. Just to maintain the German example during World War II. During World War II, when the war is practically lost after 1943, fundamentally, and both the Western and the Eastern Allies sweep into German dominated, at least, territory, you realize that there is not an extreme of war, because what happens on the Eastern Front is pretty close, theoretically, to it. It's never absolute, because the Germans make the Soviets bleed really inch after inch, and they resist till to the very end, even in Berlin in itself. On the Western Front, the Germans kind of keep fighting, but at a certain point when the Americans arrive, they start also surrendering en masse. Why? Because they knew at that point that everything was lost, and they, aside from those fanatics that remained in fighting and also forced others into fight, fundamentally, great part of the Wehrmacht surrenders to the Western Allies, resisting against the Soviets, hoping essentially a political future, that was to remain fundamentally as much as Germany could remain as much as possible within the Western sphere and not the Soviet one. So in that case, you realize that this is what von Clausewitz is saying, that the degree of tension and the vigor of the efforts are modified by these political expectations. That's a brilliant example, but that happens literally in every single war. Here it's not a matter of, making an historical example is kind of obvious and useful when reading von Clausewitz, but this works for every single war. Even in those wars when apparently everything is like a total war, like fighting to the death, there is always a component of your fort that is reduced, not necessarily just by we see in von Clausewitz there is always this dichotomy also of spirit and strengths and physical strengths fundamentally, and this is it in many ways, meaning that there are also attrition factors that bring you to even a collapse in morale, so there are so many factors that intervene to reduce the utmost use of violence, the utmost use of force, as von Clausewitz calls it. And this is really fundamental, because it's as if, I don't know, I personally picture it visually as a sort of, of war, of fighter that kind of moves into a fluid from which he gets attrition fundamentally. And this fluid is never ineliminable. I mean, every single kind of war has this attrition factor that in von Clausewitz really, if I'm not wrong, is separated from the political decisions. I mean, the political decision is influenced in turn by attritional factors, but it's two separated things there on a different level. But let's say that in practice, this translates in itself on a single variant that is in fact the degree of tension, the vigor of the forts, as von Clausewitz writes. So this is fundamental and much more important than the shortness of this paragraph would suggest, because it's in fact, together with these other statements, like that war does not consist of a single instantaneous blow that we've seen in the 8th paragraph, or that war is never an isolated act that instead is in the 7th, that war is always subjected to a control and a modification. That happens both for spiritual and material reasons, and that this cannot be eliminated. That is, you always know fundamentally, concluding fundamentally on today with this 9th paragraph, the list of demonstrations ex absurdo, that war never comes up by itself. War never exists for the sake of itself, in other words. Doesn't pop up just because you want to kill someone, therefore for the taste of it. There is always some additional reason, even if you're a psychopath, even if you are driven, I don't know by which measures. There is always a sort of difference between of distance, I would say, between the reasons, the impulse of hostility that you might have, either by instinct or by reason, and the actual use of violence. It's always different, and also that this use of violence never is never it never happens in one moment. War does not consist of a single instantaneous blow, as von Clausewitz puts it. The employment of violence is always calibrated on how this the fight evolves fundamentally. Remember the reciprocal actions that we talked about. Von Clausewitz makes this list. It's always like that. You don't fight against an idling body, something that doesn't react. You always have fundamentally some first of all, you don't know everything about your foe, so your action is always imperfect by itself, and it needs to be adjusted during the fight. Secondly, you need in fact to cope with the enemy reaction that is also actively pushing against you and could even crush you. So this is particularly important because I noticed personally that, I don't know how evident it is, but it's as if I think some of the greatest at least mistakes that is done when thinking of war today, at every level. I don't know how it was in the past, but I think it was fundamentally the same. Instinctively is thinking of yourself as the dynamic agent, fundamentally. Or at least when you think war, you always put yourself from one side of the barricade, fundamentally. You rarely, I think people rarely think at war as, there are two foes struggling, wrestling against each other, and each one has a perspective. The way we tell war in our culture, I believe, is always focusing on the perspective of one foe. And this gives often the illusion that this foe is, this fighter, this duelist, as von Clausewitz calls it, is the center of our attention, is the perspective we feel to observe that war from. This is usually, and I don't say it happens all the time, because, for instance, for World War II, I don't know, I tend to really usually look at all from all sides. That's perhaps because I got more used to analyze it from the different sides, because also there were several, actors. There was even this splitting between the Allies that fundamentally didn't quite like each other. The Western Allies didn't quite much like the Soviets, but they were brought together just because of Nazi Germany. also the same relation between the allies. Think about between Germany, Japan, and Italy. What heterogeneity you can find. Even the Western allies didn't quite like very much themselves. Objectively, the Americans and the British weren't so fond of each other. Then there were all these other countries that were called fundamentally, especially one of the Commonwealth, that were promised several different things for their participation, etc. So it's a very complex system that normally is studied in terms of, let's look at these various perspectives. But even historically speaking, when you look at, I don't know, other peoples that sometimes we don't know much about. Think about to Roman history, how many populations the Romans fought, and about how few we know, in fact, historically from their perspective, from the other side. But now perhaps I didn't make the right example, because what I really meant is that there's plenty of people that are interested in war out there, and even at the theoretical level. Here von Clausewitz is still talking at a theoretical level. He's fundamentally making you understand how certain things in war work always in the same way. But what really changes is the setting and the conditions at this point. So that every war is different, but there are these kind of fixed principles that always work in a certain fashion. I believe one of the greatest difficulties that, in fact, are that we face when we try to abstract, like saying especially things in theory, like, in fact, what happens if I attack the enemy in this way? Well, the tendency is always to say, how do I solve the equation? As if from the other side you had essentially a fixed variable, as if the enemy was kind of always the same. Also, the enemy is never always the same. You can find all the how many times you've read, especially on YouTube, what happens if I arm my army with this kind of weapon? Will I defeat the enemy? That's not like Stone Scissors paper. That's not how that works. For instance, weapons are kind of the least important thing in a war. It's way more important how much you hate each other guts to dictate the outcome of a fight than what weapon you use. But that's the point. You always have to cope with something that changes. Now, von Clausewitz has not been talking these paragraphs. Actually, he has addressed the topic, but hasn't explained how that really happens. That's what he does throughout the whole Vom Kriege. The relations between attacker and defender, how the fight goes on, etc. We will hopefully read this all at one point, but that's the trick that we often have. It's as if we always started from a condition of superiority, fundamentally, which we say, okay, we have all the means, all the instruments to defeat this enemy. So it's just you get the right formula and the enemy is done. Well, in real war, it's never like that. In real war, you may have naturally an overwhelming advantage sometimes, but at that point it's quite likely that the enemy will not put up a fight. Although, as long as there is one option that is kind of viable to make you bleed excessively, the enemy will exploit that. There are also so many wars that sometimes are simplistically explained, like, oh, this guy had to lose because this other guy was superior to him. You don't understand how often I believe I've heard it, and it really it's something that nerves me so much. It makes me nervous because it's plain stupid. You hear it everywhere. Like, people will have to say that in every single war that there had to be certain deterministic factors, some teleologism for which the outcome had to be only one. The general rule is that if someone fights, he has some reason for hoping that the fight can turn in his favor. Even if the odds are kind of unfavorable, but in real war, these odds are never completely desperate. Because one thing is fighting to the death, like, for your own reasons, that can happen, but usually, most of the times, it doesn't happen like that. Even quantitatively speaking, even the minority who exists till the very end is normally always a minority. The others give up the fight when they see that there is no. So in real war, actually, odds are always not so clearly, overwhelming for one side or the other. There is always some chance that not that fight, but let's say that what it takes for carrying out successfully that fight is too expensive for one or two sides. So that's the real problem, and that's why the Clausewitzian paradigm comes in prepotently once again, because you don't use violence and war just for the sake of itself. There's always a reason. There is always a calculation of pro and cons that has nothing to do with war in itself. It has to do with how you decide to employ war as someone who can theoretically back off. Can retire, withdraw from it. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. And if you approach military history by thinking that there has to be a winner necessarily because of certain pre-existing in a war, because of certain pre-existing conditions, well, you have probably not very clear how things really work. Also, because war is not a game in the sense it's not something you do heartily. It's not something you do because I don't know. Let's go. I don't know what to do. I'm bored. Let's go at war. It's never how it works. Everybody who engages into violence is aware of what the potential outcome, the potentially disastrous outcome can be. Because you can emerge destroyed or even killed by a fight. So even if there are naturally certain... This is interesting also at a biological level, because humans sometimes, and especially in, given the way our civilization has evolved, are really can do very stupid things. I mean, it's full of examples of war, of combats, and where people get into for no reason, for which was not worth it. And this often happens paradoxically more at an individual level than at a country level, because of many reasons that would be interesting to explain. But fundamentally, looking at it from the individual's perspective, your brain sometimes pushes you to do certain instinctive things that are actually pretty stupid to do, and that's simply because our what is stupid here? Who decides that it's stupid? There is not an absolutely right or wrong choice. What makes it stupid most of the times, especially nowadays, is in fact those that you can call political choices, let's say, or better, political factors, because our brain is really set, evolutionarily speaking, when we were still apes wandering around the land. And at that time, that violence that we still have, because civilization developed so rapidly that our genetics didn't adapt fundamentally, and this makes history also very interesting, because given back our 5,000 years, we are fundamentally the same identical beings that we are today. So the humans you study of course they could be shorter because they were worse fed and stuff like that, but biologically we are the same identical beings. maybe some phenotypes have changed, yeah, some reason, but they're very superficial. The way our brain works is the same. So this the point here is that our brain is still set on that kind of prehistorical behavior that is very difficult to reconcile with our own society today. Our society is largely artificial. That also depended on the fact that seemingly our neurological system evolved at a much faster rate than the rest of our body did. So that, especially with the opposing thumb, we basically speeded up our ability to do complex things, and we came up with this. Our civilization today is something in this sense completely artificial, in the sense that it's undetached. It's completely detached from what the rest of our biological structure is meant to live in, fundamentally. So there are many stupid things that you can do, including crime and all things to which violence is sometimes and often engaged. Rage, this idea of going crazy and beating the shit out of someone for no apparent reason. Well, it's because sometimes we are really put under heavy stress. We really do, and our brain just tells us attack, something like that. And I know there are we sometimes stigmatize this, like that person is crazy. Yeah, that person might be crazy, might be an idiot, might be a criminal, might be a violent person. At the same time, there is a component of aggressiveness that we constantly repress, that sometimes outbursts, and in that case it's a stupid action, because for our world it is stupid, but at the same time this violence is fundamentally something immediate that happens. Well, now I'm not trying to justify violence in this sense. I wanted just to make the the comparison with violence that instead is exercised by states, by countries. Countries have, in this sense, a much greater amount of complexity than a single human being that is already an extremely complex system by him or herself. So the countries have this, systems that are political, in fact, in nature, that ended up essentially in delegating someone, even for the use of violence. Actually, it's debatable, but most, I believe, of associated life, of human communities, fundamentally, are created on the base of leadership. So this leadership is not necessarily a military leadership, but it contains in itself the option, the task, the potential task of using violence. This is particularly important because that's what von Clausewitz basically says, is that you can never exclude the use of force from political action. And now I will not go further into the complex topics that I not even know very well from a strictly scientific point of view of why this is the case, how human society is fundamentally organized in this fashion, but it's nevertheless very meaningful to see that our societies have much to do with the way, at least, we manage violence, not really in which we exercise violence, but in which violence can be potentially exerted. In this sense, there is a much higher degree of thoughtfulness of the political body than the single individual body for what concerns the use of violence, which is that individual courage or craziness is boundless in every human. It's very interesting to study military history, how there is every once in a while, that single crazy weirdo that for no apparent reason throws himself against the enemy to get slaughtered, but this very fierce amount of courage, and this happens all the time. Basically, there's no time in history that I've been reading about that I don't find this kind of. They're an exception, but they happen because sometimes that person maybe is not even crazy by itself, but is put under pressure in that specific context that makes him react wildly. Well, governments actually never behave like this. I mean, they can obviously tend towards the excess, towards the extreme, but usually if you bring a country to into war, you're gonna meet a much higher resistance, and an attrition factor, and attrition in general, than pushing one single person to fight. So this makes wars and fundamentally more considered than individuals. It's as if society formed sort of security, sort of security check for the usual the use of violence. This is very interesting because it's eventually an evolutionary dynamics that all individuals engage themselves into in some measure, because we are so heavily influenced by what other people in our society do. And one of these actions now, which still survives in spite of the complexity of our societies, is okay. Let's think it twice before going to war. But not really. It's full of people out there who wouldn't mind their country to go to war, and that their decision would be immediately, let's go to it. But when you couple this person only, for instance, with another one, here we see that things change, because from that confrontation, usually a more cautious attitude emerges, because it's as if it was written in our genes, and at that point we have to think not just about ourselves or someone that, by the way, because if that happened to ourselves, we would also be very, very considerate. But sometimes we say, fuck society, fuck other people, we don't care. Let's just do something crazy. Well, when you are put into that society face to face, usually you don't think, or at least you don't act like that anymore. So that's also why in the Clausewitzian trinity, let's say, politics approaches what should be, the most reasonable, the most rational actor between considering the other two, that are the people and the military. So it's very meaningful that for von Clausewitz, the people is really the one that has this very fierce and aggressive and hostile intentions. The military appears really instead like a sort of gambler that enjoys the game of war for itself, the probability, the pure action of spirit, if I'm not wrong, what von Clausewitz says. Well, the politics instead should be the brain, the thinking brain, the one that decides whether to unleash whether to give fundamentally ordered action to the fury of the people. I don't think von Clausewitz uses the term fury, but this kind of a style, sentiments rather than thinking. That's also true because objectively masses have this kind of instinctive reactions. You would say, but this is kind of instead of it's different from just saying, weren't humans in society more considerate than the individual? Yes, they do, but masses are still pushed by certain movements of hostility that, however, are pretty badly organized. It's like in manifestations. You find all this bunch of fundamentally primitive apes who shout, who throw stones, and so that's just a rabble. And war, politics, and the military come into action, in fact, when you have things like, a disciplined police that, even with much less numbers, just with order and discipline, kicks that rabble away. Well, that's what politics and military do jointly, but they do it on behalf of that much greater rabble, let's say, that the people is. So the relation is more complex than what it seems, also more complicated than what it seems. But all this speech was fundamentally to to say that the way, in fact, the politics and the military get into play in the game of war, let's say, is something way more considerate, and that has much more thoughtful interests fundamentally for that action. Remember that you can't exclude really from the people also that maybe that elite, that minority that maybe has a greater control on society, and it fundamentally brings the government to go to war in a way or another. So here you can talk about politics like the usual populistic perception that, you know, the government is fundamentally just something on its own that does only its own interests. It's never like that. Society is always engaged into this. The society is always interested in part, and even when there is a conflictuality within you, there are reflections at the political level, because all the great military disasters are chiefly political disasters. They're not really military, because something went wrong. If something went wrong in that war, it's not because much of what was happening in that war. The means of war are practically almost the same. It's really the political commitment that at that point was not considered, and that usually comes because there is a division in politics that comes from the people, usually. So that's also very meaningful in my opinion. But this is how wars have to be considered. They're not something that are fought for some stupid reason. There are always very deep and kind of valid, at least motivations, which doesn't justify war. I'm not saying that war is justified in this sense. It's very difficult to justify war, and it's always been a great challenge because everybody fundamentally tried to do it. But it's just like saying that when you study war, you can't study war like, you know, there was a crazy guy who wanted to make war, and that's how it went. Because that's also very stupid narrative. It's like with World War II. Many people just think, especially that there are so many people who are obsessed with an abstract tyranny that is embodied just by one man. For many people, World War II was caused only because of the single individual of Hitler. But this is wrong, historically speaking. If that guy had been alone with, against basically his whole country, that would have never happened. The myth that totalitarianism, wherever in the world, is fundamentally just enforced by a minority, and that this doesn't work at a social level, it's not at least triggered by some social participation, is actually a gross historical misunderstanding. It happens in a totalitarian regime is able to, for instance, to disarm the citizenry, is able to enforce its rule. But also in here, besides the fact that it's very difficult to control a system that is fundamentally, just think at how the Soviet Union ended. The Soviet Union ended because fundamentally the economy was going, of course, bad, because that it's the economical, the political and economical formula at the base that had serious problems. But it also began because all those countries that is fundamentally the Russians rather than the Soviets abstractly occupied were now rebelling in some measure, and they were making the whole system shattered. So even in that case, you had the Soviets that had some of the most devastating military arsenals in the world, and yet that system still collapsed. So that obviously the Soviets had the deterrent to commit mass slaughters but in the 80s, in the 90s, that would have been impossible to achieve. Of course, the Americans would have not allowed, but in general, the same at that point within the same Soviet Union, it would have been questionable whether to do that. Also because by slaughtering So many people, the whole even economical fabric, socio-economical fabric of the say the Eastern Bloc would have collapsed in some way. So you realize even in here how there are so many factors that it's never just violence in itself that can solve the thing. It's not, and violence is always guided. It's always an instrument. It's really the political action. That's also why violence in itself is nor moral nor immoral. Violence is just a mere instrument, and that's how it fundamentally is used. And you have to have reasons, and a valid base, a valid I don't know how to say this, conditions fundamentally in order to use it and to achieve your goal fundamentally, which is also very difficult to achieve, because violence is always something immediately. Another thing that always gets me extremely agitated, say legitimately I don't even know, altered. It's kind of a fitting. It's the idea that the war is inhuman. That war, this is probably the most stupid thing you can hear ever, and in fact it's a culturalist assumption. This shouldn't be. The idea that war is primitive, that war belongs only to the realm of easy feelings, of instincts. Only bad people use it. Absolutely not. History, and von Clausewitz, by the way, demonstrated very clearly that the destructiveness of a civilization does not decrease with its progress. On the quite contrary, is true. And violence and war is fought just as an option that you always have in your pocket. It's just an instrument. What it can be really moral or immoral is the political decision. That's what really makes the point. War in itself has nothing moral or immoral. It's just an instrument. It's so simple. It's just with a gun. The problem is not the gun in itself. The problem was used it for. And there's a big difference whether you use a gun to disarm a criminal that is threatening other people's lives, and another between, if you're the criminal with a gun that is committing that crime. That's really the watershed. It's not the gun in itself. It's not the violence in itself. So whoever thinks that war is somewhat a stupid decision that every once in a while a country makes for no valid reason is fundamentally naive at best. And this doesn't mean that war should be done just gratuitously. There are mistakes that are done in conducting wars. I think we live in a period in which we realize how the military instrument sometimes is misused, or, not that it's misused, but it's sometimes also misused, because there are countries who are not capable of, they don't have a political and they don't have a strategical culture, and this is a problem also for their self-standing in the world as free countries. But let's say that the military instrument is sometimes used poorly, with poor planning, without understanding the consequences. That's a problem. But usually, if war is fought, there is always some kind of solid, sound motivation. And it's very it happens very frequently, telling the truth, to have to get these perceptions like war is just it's done because that state is evil. Well, if you think like that, it's because you have given up history. Let's be honest. You've given up any will to understand what is going on in wars and why countries get into war, because wars are extremely costly and extremely dangerous, and governments know this at all times. So also in there are better or worse decisions, but reducing international politics to simply saying, oh, okay, there are the good guys and the bad guys, and if I had been in their place, I would have done better. It's child talk fundamentally, and there are strategic analysts will work years and years to figure out exactly how certain things happen or have already happened in one place. The first guy who wakes up in the morning without having read anything and saying, "Oh, that war is evil," or "that war is wrong," that they shouldn't have done this. I have an easy solution. I have an easy answer. It doesn't work. It's like with history. It's very easy to sentence shade about history. Probably I do it very often myself, which happens the more you talk, and the more chances are that you will at one point. But there is a big difference between speaking about things you know and speaking about things you don't know. And you should always try to say, okay, because you can't know everything, you can't even know fully what you're trying to explain. So you should get to a sort of also in there, it's based on your moral standards, fundamentally, how approximate your narrative should be. There's never such a thing like a true history. It's never been, never will be, by definition. But still there is an enormous difference between, one guy will just come out of high school and, a 60 years old professor has studied, has read thousands of volumes about a single topic. There is a difference. Then it doesn't mean that it's always true, but tendentially, and that's what the balance. It's very Aristotelian in a way. There is always a middle ground that should always balance things out. But perhaps the most important of these points that we have seen is that this last one, this paragraph we commented in, the result in war is never absolute. So this is a very hard lesson, because you basically can't eradicate an enemy. I mean, seriously, even if you wipe this guy out literally with a nuclear arsenal and you say, okay, I really have literally vaporized him, the point is that this has some consequences even in the way you used that element. First of all, because you don't live in a vacuum where there are just you and that person. Secondly, it's in real wars, let's say, the chance of literally annihilating an entire enemy is basically never reached. First of all, it's an enormous effort. Secondly, it has an enormous cost in terms of even how you are perceived. I mean, it's as if, it's like in a society when there is a psychopath that maybe kills a person because he's not able to distinguish his or her own feelings. That's what psychopaths basically are, and that's why they kill so cruelly. It's not because they're actually cruel, it's because they can't feel feelings. And that's a very serious psychiatric issue, as you can understand. But even in that case, nobody likes to live close to a psychopath. Let's be honest about it, because if you have one guy that is up to use nuclear weapons just to, for wiping out an entire country, well, just imagine what the world reaction would be. And that's why we're so worried about things like that happen in, with North Korea, that has Seoul so close that basically you can't even almost intercept. You don't even need nuclear weapons. You can simply launch a bombardment to this major metropolis in the east of Asia without being able to stop it. Now, but even in there, you see that it doesn't happen, and that North Korea is not that stupid to cause that problem, because all that cares about, in fact, is political. It's keeping its population oppressed, isolated, in order to maintain a corrupt regime. They don't care about wiping out Seoul, but they fuel, for instance, the people's feelings to believe that, because it's the South Koreans were such a corrupted, evil enemy that is aligned with the terrible Americans and so on and all this. And that's the real point. Nobody's using that, so it's mostly the threat of violence, the deterrence that actually even plays into this, which is already enough to say, okay, that guy is dangerous. It destabilizes the situation. So that's also, interestingly enough, the point is that we are social beings. Even von Clausewitz here, when he was making the example of the duelists, as if war is a matter of two people isolated. Well, that's theoretical. That's just the definition von Clausewitz gives in principle, but von Clausewitz always thinks about the Trinity, so-called Trinity. And to the fact that in fact, we are social beings. You have seen there are allies that intervene. There are third parts that are observing what happens in war and interfere into war, as we've seen in the last paragraph, by the way. The day before yesterday. That intervene usually even when the war is fundamentally still only when the war fundamentally has begun, at least most of the times, or very often, very frequently, and they usually intervene to re-equilibrate the balance. It's as if there was a balance that in fact has to be understood even in international politics as a sort of social balance. It's as if all the various countries were single people, all with their own interests and so on. So this is, I believe, the lesson you can draw from it. And the fact that the result in war is never absolute is like, never think that it's over. Also, always think that the use of violence has effects that are sometimes even more sometimes kind of even more impacting our perception, our culture, our society. I always make the example of, for instance, of economical policies that kill hundreds of millions. Even certain products that are sold, take cigarettes, those actively kill people. It's as if it's the same equivalent of giving a gun in the hand of someone and letting them shoot. But we go nuts. In fact, if I don't know, in a war there are 1,000 kills, and then we don't care about all the other things that actually kill, and like tens and thousands more than that, and we don't care. So even in here, I believe what the lesson is that we're still very much impressed instinctively by things. Like, war is something, is even very theatrical, very scenographic in its way. It's very effective. It's spectacular. That's the term I wanted to use. It's something everybody's kind of worried by. It's like, I don't know, what happened here in the West in general, sometimes with Desert Storm. When in winter 1991, America started its bombings on, it started its invasion of Iraq. People were still obsessed with Cold War mentality. I mean, the idea that if someone pulled the trigger all of a sudden for some domino reaction, everybody would die because of a nuclear holocaust. Well, Desert Storm was a very well confined operation, very well carried out. That is also one of most brilliant examples of the military mean that is called out at a certain point by politics. Just to reconfirm once again the Clausewitzian paradigm. But on that occasion, this is interesting. There were people who, knowing on the war, started aggressing supermarkets to buy supplies to store, because they feared that because of the war in Iraq, the World War III would have started. Because people were not absolutely understanding, of course, what the international situation was, that nothing would have happened under that point. They were so just impressed by war, and we're talking about essentially not even 30 years ago. So, just for the record, we have a strange relation with war, which is very irrational. Von Clausewitz is the medicine here. Von Clausewitz is the treatment. Von Clausewitz is the one who tells you, look, let's look at what war really is, and let's do it for you. Because I already know what it is. I'm just telling you for your own benefit. I've been into war ever since I was 12, and I spent all my life fighting. I've seen so many battles, talked to so many officers, etc. I know, I've seen it all before. I know what this is about, and I also know that the other military theorists got it wrong because they have other objectives, other ideas that they're faulty. Here I'm telling you what war is. So von Clausewitz is a friend, nothing more but your friend, everybody's friend from our regard. Maybe he was not a friend of people who killed, but that's the point. You know that war sometimes happens. So in order not to be found unprepared in this eventuality, because you may find war repulsive, but you should nevertheless find yourself into it. So you have to know how to deal with it, because the consequences for your country could be extraordinarily important. Von Clausewitz fundamentally started to write the Vom Kriege, observing what had happened to his own country with the French conquest of Prussia, that had triggered so many feelings within that nation, that's understanding of what the relation with politics of war. Interestingly enough, Prussia was emerging. Now, in fact, at the time of 1806, Prussian armed forces weren't that much. In fact, the French kind of defeated them pretty soundly at Jena Auerstedt. But the Prussians, up to a few decades before, were the army of Frederick the Great, Frederick II. They had the military glory. Napoleon was considering himself fundamentally a Frederican in terms of military theory. So there is also this in here emotional and psychologistic, I would say. I know it sounds bad, but effect. I mean, the idea that chiefly pertains to the people, that is the idea, okay, our military is always kind of out there, so we can fundamentally not to think about the business of war and how our military forces should be organized and employed and so on. And that's terribly mistaken, because as a citizen especially, as a subject you're prevented to do it, but as a citizen you have a duty, a civic duty also to watch over your own armed forces. Not just because they are fighting for you, but because those are same citizens that are fighting for the whole country. It's also very sad today that we are coming back to an ideology in many places of the West, for which essentially the military is a sort of case on its own, and that people is something different. We need even to qualify them as warriors, not anymore as as citizen soldiers. You find this garbage ideas going around as if people really believe that true modern military men should be warriors and not soldiers. Say, study something about military history and learn what a warrior is and what a soldier is and why we need soldiers, not warriors. And because you want to make this kind of emotionally effective talking about the warrior, because it evokes such, in fact, instinctive reasons. Well, it's instinctive feelings. Well, military history teaches us that instinctive feelings are crushed by reason into war. Because in war, it's not the strongest that wins, or the more courageous. It's the more intelligent, by rule. That can also happen otherwise, but it normally doesn't happen. And do you want warriors instead of soldiers? You want to conceive your your military as a bunch of unleashed warhounds that are sent against you. That's not how it works. War is something that has to be thought, civically speaking, very deeply at a political level. Otherwise, you have disasters. So that you can even have the strongest military in the world, but doing very serious mistakes. that have effects. This is what in this paragraph von Clausewitz is telling us implicitly, is that not only the resulting war is never absolute, so you can't think to fundamentally set things up because problems are just keeping popping out. This is, I think, the history of the last 10 years, especially in the Mediterranean. The Near East speaks pretty much for itself regarding to this, but not only, but you're gonna have people are gonna remember this. So this heavily plays on politics because it basically brings you to a situation in which you're not alone. You're not just there are two people on Earth. You kill that person. You the other person, you got it. You live into a world with billions of other people, with so many other countries, and then just yours and one of the enemy. So you can't reason realistically in terms like of absolute war, of total war. That the Nazis, for instance, resorted in 1943, having acknowledged that the war was lost, practically speaking, at least, to the idea of total war, taking it and distorting it from Clausewitz, from the Clausewitzian theory, to do what essentially? Well, of course, now the Germans were resisting very harshly, but it's not that they were fighting less or more than what they had done before. The point now was trying just to convince the population that now it was total war, that now the truth, all the strengths of the Germans would have been brought out and they would have achieved victory. No, they were losing the war. War was already lost. It was just a matter of time. So, but even the picture of things like total war, and this very punching expressions and so on are very meaningful in our society. They echo very deeply, and they can even convince the naive that that's a thing. Well, I believe that the more we discussed from military history, and the more we get that naive, the more we renounce to our political responsibility, the more we turn our back, the more we cause mistake and ultimately other pain and other sufferance, instead of building a functional world where you can't eliminate war or conflict for that matter, but you can still reduce it to that minimum for everybody to live in, the better as possible. And that's our duty, I believe, in many ways. That's the reason why I still have some confidence in civilization. I still have some trust in the human capabilities as we live objectively, in spite of everything, in one of the most peaceful times in history, in spite of all. Well, I'm sure there is the person who pops out and says, this is not one of the most peaceful times in history, the end is near, we want just to kill each other. Well, that's the naive attitude I'm talking to you about. Because if a person doesn't know what he's talking about and just sees war as a kind of a weird entity that floats in the air and every once in a while lands here and there, we don't know what to do with that person, civically speaking. It's just a dead weight, fundamentally, and it's his or her vote is even dangerous for peace. In fact, I firmly believe that pacifists are alarmingly dangerous for world peace in general, because their thinking leads to a much more conflictual world than the one that already exists, and also dramatically. Of course, also militarism does. So pacifism and militarism objectively couldn't exist without each other in some way. Also in here there should be a much greater comment, I believe, because I don't think they're the same exact thing. I think they're on two different levels. In any case, they're not good, even taken separately. So, but yeah. Alright, today I just tried to compensate this very short 9th paragraph with some other further consideration. So for now, okay, now we will read other relatively short paragraphs. The next one is on the probabilities of a real life take place, of the conceptions of the extreme and the absolute. Yeah, kind of interesting. Okay, so for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you as always heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.